Mum, who's not Mum? Ethan was only 6, and he never liked being in the dark. It wasn't that he was scared of shadows or imagined monsters under the bed, he just had an uncanny sense that something didn't quite fit. That evening, though, the shadows weren't what bothered him. It was the voice. He'd been playing with his toy cars, scattered across the living room floor, making engine noises and pretending they were racing each other on the winding roads of an imaginary track. The house was quiet, too quiet, really. His mom had been in the kitchen, but she had fallen silent, and that in itself was unusual. She was always humming or muttering something under her breath. Ethan hated when it got too quiet. So, when he heard her call his name from the other room, it felt off. Ethan! The voice came from the direction of the hallway, the sound clear and sharp, as though she were standing just behind the door of her bedroom. But his mom wasn't there. He knew she wasn't there. He'd been listening to the sounds of her clinking dishes just moments before, in the kitchen, the farthest room from the hallway. His heart skipped a beat. Mom? Ethan called back, a little confused. His voice wavered. There was a long pause before the voice called again. Ethan, come here. I need you. Ethan's small hands froze on his toy car, the wheels halted mid-spin. His mind raced. He could see her in his head, her worn apron, the messy bun she always tied up to cook, and her soft blue eyes that were always tired, but warm. But something was wrong. The way the voice echoed down the empty hallway felt strange. It was too clear, too commanding. Furrowing his brow, Ethan stood up and shuffled toward the hallway, his bare feet quietly padding against the hardwood floor. He reached for the door handle to his mother's bedroom, but as his fingers brushed the cool metal, he hesitated. The voice called again. This time, it sounded more urgent. Ethan, now. His stomach twisted. He couldn't move. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as an overwhelming chill washed over him. Something didn't feel right. That wasn't how his mom sounded, was it? She'd never been so forceful. She always asked him gently. The door to the room remained shut, darkened by the heavy curtains that blocked out the light. He wanted to open it. He wanted to see her, to run to her and hear her warm, tired voice reassure him. But then, a strange thought crept into his mind, a feeling so deep and insistent, he couldn't ignore it. What if it wasn't his mom? What if it was something else pretending to be her? Suddenly, the silence of the house pressed in on him, smothering him with its weight. His breath came out sharp as he took a step back. No, he couldn't do it. He couldn't open that door. The moment his hand fell away from the handle, the voice cut through the silence once more. It was almost angry now, and it made Ethan's blood run cold. Ethan, I said, come here now. Ethan didn't move. Then, just as quickly as it started, the voice stopped. The house returned to its unnatural silence. His heart pounded in his chest. His mom hadn't called him. He swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. The air felt thick with something heavy, something not quite right. He turned and ran, back to the safety of the living room, his little legs carrying him faster than he thought possible. He collapsed onto the couch, clutching a pillow to his chest. What was that? What had just happened? In the kitchen, he could hear her again. The soft clink of dishes, the hum of her favorite song. But that wasn't her voice, was it? The night came quickly, as it always did. But this time, the dark seemed different. The house felt colder, quieter. Ethan lay in bed, his blanket pulled up to his chin, his eyes fixed on the door of his room. Every creak of the house sent his heart into overdrive, every shadow seemed to move just a little too fast, and every noise, every sound, felt like a warning. He stared at the door, the crack of light seeping through the edges, and it was then that he heard it again. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. But this time, the voice wasn't coming from the hallway. No, it came from the basement. "Ethan, come to me." It was his mother's voice. He knew it was. He'd recognize it anywhere, and yet, this time, it didn't comfort him. It made his blood run cold. The basement door, just outside his bedroom, stood ajar, the darkness within threatening to consume everything it touched. Ethan's chest tightened. He couldn't move. He wanted to call out to his mom, but she wasn't upstairs anymore. She wasn't in the kitchen. Where was she? And why was she in the basement? His heart hammered in his chest as his mind raced. No, this wasn't right. His mom never went to the basement. They never used it. She had always told him to stay away from it, to never open that door. It was dark and damp, full of boxes and old furniture. It smelled musty, like it hadn't been opened in years. But this voice, it sounded like her. It was her. Ethan, please. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, biting down on his lip to stop himself from calling out. But he couldn't resist. Mom? His voice shook. The door to the basement creaked louder, the sound echoing through the house. Then came the slow, steady footfalls, the unmistakable sound of someone walking toward him. But it wasn't her. It couldn't be. The voice, that voice, was different. It was deeper, hollow. And it was getting closer. Ethan's body froze in place. His limbs turned to stone. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. And yet, that voice, it was so familiar, so achingly close. Suddenly, in the eerie silence, a whisper came into his mind, so clear, so chilling, that it stopped him dead in his tracks. If you look, you won't come back. It was the voice of the house, a warning, perhaps, or something else altogether. But Ethan couldn't ignore it. Not this time. The hair on the back of his neck prickled, his pulse roaring in his ears. What was in the basement? What was it that wanted him there? He turned his gaze toward the door, his heart a frantic beat against his chest. There was something else down there. Something that wasn't his mother. And then, in that moment, the voice called out again, not from the basement anymore, but from somewhere deeper, more sinister. Ethan. I'm waiting for you. And Ethan knew. If he went down there, if he took even a single step closer, he would never return. The words echoed in Ethan's head, chilling his very core. The voice, his mother's voice, had turned so warped, so unrecognizable, that it no longer felt like a plea, but a command, an unholy summons. His small body quivered under the weight of it, the fear crawling under his skin like 1,000 invisible hands. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head as though he could banish the sound, the terror, the feeling that was slowly suffocating him. He thought about his mother, the woman who had always been there, who held him close, who kissed his forehead goodnight. This was not her. But still, he could not tear his eyes away from the darkened basement door, its shadow stretching out like a dark hand across the floor of the hallway. The air felt heavier, thick with dread. The house was quiet now, deathly still, save for that haunting voice calling to him from below. And then there was the silence again, so heavy, so thick it almost pressed in on him. Ethan's heart beat in his ears, a dull throb that seemed to stretch the time between each breath, each blink, until everything around him felt suspended in some kind of eerie eternity. The door to the basement was wide open now, as though it had been waiting for him, ready for him to step into its depths. The voice, though faint, was still there, whispering his name like a breath of wind through the cracks in the house, making the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Ethan. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream for help, to wake up, to do anything but stand there, on the edge of something that felt worse than death itself. But his body refused to move. It was as if the voice had taken control of him, weaving its power into his limbs, making him paralyzed, frozen in place. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice changed. It was softer now, almost tender. It was as though his mother was pleading with him, her voice wrapped in warmth and concern, the same tone she used when she told him stories before bed. Come, Ethan. I need you. You'll be safe with me. Just come to me. The words sliced through him, the warmth in them like a balm on his raw, exposed nerves. But something deep inside him resisted. He knew that he could not go down there. His mother had told him to never go into the basement. She had warned him so many times. But he had never understood why, not really. Now, as the voice wrapped itself around him, his heart aching with the need to trust, to believe, a cold realization began to dawn on him. The woman calling his name, the voice that sounded so sweet, so familiar, it wasn't his mother. It couldn't be. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, and for the first time Ethan forced himself to move. His feet felt like lead, his legs trembling, but he staggered backward, his pulse pounding like a war drum in his ears. The basement door loomed in front of him, and the darkness beyond it felt like it was stretching, pulling at him, as though it could reach out and swallow him whole. And then, like a warning, the whisper came again, the voice that wasn't his mother. "If you look, you won't come back." Ethan's chest tightened. He stumbled backward, his mind screaming at him to run, to leave, to do anything but stand there. He had no idea what would happen if he dared to go down there, but the fear was all-consuming, seeping into his bones like ice water. But as he turned to run, he heard something that stopped him dead in his tracks. A soft thud came from the bottom of the stairs. And then another, followed by a low, dragging sound, like someone, or something, was pulling itself up from the darkness. Ethan spun around, his breath hitching in his throat, his eyes darting to the staircase leading down into the basement. The sound was slow, deliberate, dragging like the shuffle of something far too heavy for a human being to carry. The hairs on his neck stood on end. His stomach lurched with a sickening lurch as the footsteps grew louder, closer. He took a step back, then another, his heart racing like it would burst out of his chest. But the sound didn't stop. It was as though whatever was down there was coming for him, slowly but surely, dragging itself toward him, its presence filling the space with something foul, something wrong. And then, just as he thought he couldn't bear it any longer, the door to the basement creaked open fully. The dark figure that emerged from within was too vague, too shadowy to make out at first, but there was something wrong about it. Something in the way it moved, like it wasn't quite in the same reality as the rest of the house. It paused at the top of the stairs. Ethan didn't dare look closer. The voice came again, but it wasn't the sweet, familiar call of his mother anymore. This was something else, something deep, hollow, and full of hunger. "Ethan. I'm waiting." With that, the figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, into the light. It was her. Or it looked like her. Ethan's body froze in terror. The woman standing in the doorway of the basement looked like his mother, but her face was wrong, too still, too expressionless. Her eyes, dark as pitch, glimmered with something unnatural. Her lips barely moved as she spoke, the words more of a rasp than a voice. "Come, Ethan," she whispered. "Come, home." He felt the cold grasp of fear take hold of him, and his mind screamed to run, to flee, to never look back. But his legs betrayed him, frozen to the floor, his feet rooted to the spot. The thing in front of him wasn't his mother. No, it couldn't be. This was something far darker, something that only wore her skin. And as it slowly advanced toward him, Ethan realized something that would haunt him forever. This thing that wore his mother's face, would never let him leave. Ethan opened his mouth to scream. But no sound came out. Ethan's chest tightened, his mouth dry as dust, his heart thundering in his ears. The figure, his mother's face, was closer now, too close, too wrong. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey, as if some unseen force was holding him in place, tethered to the darkness that had crawled up from below. The woman, if it could still be called that, reached out slowly, her fingers impossibly long, bending in unnatural ways, like they didn't belong to a human at all. Her touch hovered inches from his face, a chill that sent waves of nausea through him. Her eyes, those black, empty eyes, locked onto his with an intensity that made the air itself feel suffocating, like it was being sucked from the room. "Ethan," she rasped, her voice now a guttural growl, thick with something ancient and hungry. It wasn't the voice of the woman who had tucked him into bed every night. This was the voice of something far older, far darker. "You shouldn't have looked." Ethan felt a cold finger trace down his cheek, the touch like ice, sending a shudder deep into his bones. His skin crawled, the hair on his neck standing on end, and he finally found his voice. A scream, hoarse and frantic, tore its way from his throat, but it was quickly swallowed by the thick, suffocating darkness around him. It felt as though the world had collapsed inward, all sound fading away except for the sickening rasp of her breath, the soft shuffle of her movements, and the pulsing rhythm of his own panicked heart. "Run, Ethan. Run!" He screamed in his mind, but his feet were still glued to the ground, trapped by whatever evil force held him here. The thing that had once been his mother stepped forward, the floor creaking beneath its unnatural weight. The shadow of its form seemed to stretch unnaturally, casting grotesque, shifting shapes on the walls. The darkness swelled around him, thickening, consuming the light from the hallway. Ethan could no longer see anything clearly. Only shadows, crawling and twisting, as though the very walls were alive. "Why did you have to look?" it hissed, its voice now no longer pretending to be anything human. "Now, you will stay with me. Forever." With a flash of movement that was too quick for his eyes to follow, the thing's hand shot out, grabbing Ethan by the wrist with a strength that was far beyond anything his small body could resist. The coldness of its grip seeped into his very bones, paralyzing him, and for the first time, he felt the weight of the terrible truth. He wasn't going to escape. His mind raced. There had to be something. Anything. But all he could think about was how wrong this felt. It wasn't his mother, it couldn't be. But the face, the voice. They had looked so real. Ethan fought against the grip, his small body trembling with the effort, but it was useless. The thing pulled him closer, its hollow eyes never leaving his face. The basement door creaked open wider, and with it came the scent of something rotten, something decayed, a stench so foul it burned his nose and made his stomach turn. "You were never meant to see," it muttered, pulling him forward into the cold blackness of the basement. "I waited so long for you to come down here." Ethan struggled, kicking his legs, but every movement seemed weaker, the very air draining his strength. It was as though something in the house itself was feeding on his fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. His mind raced, desperately grasping for something, anything, that could save him. But the harder he tried to break free, the stronger the grip became. His legs moved automatically now, dragging him toward the basement stairs, his eyes still locked on the thing that wore his mother's face. Its lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it, only hunger. "You should have listened, Ethan," it whispered again. "There's no escape now." With a sudden, brutal yank, the thing pulled him down the stairs, into the basement. The stairs creaked under the weight, each step feeling like it was taking him further into an abyss. The temperature seemed to drop with each step, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the air grew colder, denser. The basement stretched out before him in a suffocating black void, the shadows swallowing everything in their path. Ethan's eyes darted frantically around, desperate to make sense of the unfamiliar space. There was something unnatural about the way the shadows moved, like they were alive, constantly shifting, whispering, and crawling just out of sight. He couldn't hear anything anymore, not the creak of the stairs, not his own heartbeat. It was all drowned out by the thick silence that pressed in on him, crushing his chest. The thing, still gripping his wrist with its icy fingers, pushed him further into the depths of the basement, each step heavy with the knowledge that he was walking towards something far worse than he could ever have imagined. The walls were bare, but there was something else in the room, something that sent a fresh wave of terror washing over him. A mirror. It stood against the far wall, tall and ancient, its surface reflecting only darkness. No matter how hard Ethan looked, the reflection remained distorted, the image warped and blurry, as if something was fighting to break free from it. The thing behind him dragged him closer, its grip tightening, and in the mirror's surface, Ethan saw something that made his blood run cold. A face. His mother's face, but not. It was distorted, wrong, her features twisted into a grotesque mask of anguish, as though something was clawing at her from the inside. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. And then the reflection moved, a shadow breaking free from the glass and reaching out toward him. "No," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "No. No." The thing that had once been his mother stepped closer, its breath cold on his neck as it leaned in, its lips brushing against his ear. "You never should have looked." And with that, it shoved him toward the mirror. The world blurred, time itself stretching and bending as Ethan's body was pulled into the dark glass, his scream swallowed by the emptiness, lost in the void. In the darkness, he understood. Some things were never meant to be seen. And some things never let you leave.